contribution. Thank you.
I call the honourable member David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I'd like to do is to just follow on from Pete Hodgson's contribution there, because I think he makes a really important point which actually cuts to the very heart of the purpose of this bill, which is actually the incorporation of the humanities into the Royal Society. And I was reflecting on his contribution before, as he was speaking, that in fact the Prime Minister's science advisor is looking very much at the issue of evidence, and of scientific evidence in particular, in the contribution that can make to policy. And while we support that, and of course we should be making decisions on the basis of evidence, and he makes this quite clear, that we should be at least have the evidence presented in front of us, and as a result of that evidence we should make the decision. Now we may decide to take that evidence into consideration in the decision on policy, or we may, for political reasons, decide to ignore it or only take some of it into consideration. But nevertheless, that evidence is before us, and he makes, I think, Peter Gluckman makes a very good point in that regard. However, I think what Pete Hodgson was also saying there, that it's not just scientific evidence that is important in what we consider in the consideration of policy, but also history. And he mentioned Te Reo, the Maori language. That too is important when we're looking at policy in this particular place. And I'd like to, Mr. Chair, getting back to the first part A of the purpose clause in clause 4 of this bill, to reflect on what the Royal Society itself actually says about the inclusion of the humanities in this bill, and it recognises that the humanities is a big step forward, an important step forward that the Royal Society is making. It also notes that it was November 2008, and Grant Robertson talked about this before in terms of the date of this particular piece of legislation and how it came into being. But in 2008, the Council of the Royal Society resolved that there was a need to expand the object and the functions of the Society to include humanities. So we're looking at this now 2.5 years on from when it was first considered. And what it went on to say, and I think this is important, Mr. Chair. It says the decision to extend and enhance the Royal Society's Academy to include researchers from across all disciplines of science, technology, social sciences and humanity is a landmark decision. It recognises that this is not just a decision that was suddenly dreamed up by the Royal Society and the Academy of the Royal Society, but it was in fact considered over a long period of time by the Royal Society. And I think that was one thing, as we were in the Select Committee, Mr. Chair, that we recognised and valued, that this was not an ad hoc decision. And it goes on to say, and I want to again just quote from what the Royal Society's submission, the submission that it made. There is a growing appreciation at both national and international levels of the need for greater cross-disciplinary dialogue to address the global problems that now occupy much of the research agenda. And that really comes back to what Pete Hodgson was just saying in terms of his contribution. I think that, in fact, his contribution chimes very well with what the Royal Society was trying to get at and why it wanted to make this landmark change. And it goes on again to say the enhanced fellowship at the centre of the Royal Society mirrors the situation in many of the world's leading academies. The strengthening of the capacity will enable the Royal Society to provide a significant contribution to present and emerging debates. And I think, Mr. Chair, that sort of sums up the reason that we're here tonight debating this bill, and I say a debate, in many ways, it's a traversing of the issues. Mr. Chair.
I call the
Mr. Chair.
Honourable Member David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll wait for the Honourable Parker Harameda to return. Sir, Mr. Chair, I didn't want to be unkind. I probably should have sat down. I feel somewhat guilty now, to be honest with you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just getting back on track with regard to the Royal Society Bill. We had about 13 submissions to the bill that we heard very carefully. A number of those were made in person. They were made very passionately by people who were very concerned that the object of the Royal Society was going to be eroded. And I just want to reflect on the contribution of Bob Brockie. Bob Brockie, who was actually a weekly columnist for the Dominion Post, and also a scientist in his own right as well. And I think what I'd like to do is just to note what he actually noted quite articulately about what he feels his opposition to the inclusion of the humanities into the Royal Society's bill. And he says that the Royal Society might think that it's doing God's work by bringing the sciences and the arts together. I don't think this is the role of a scientific society, which should stick to its knitting. From my observation, there is very little traffic between the worlds of science and arts, and that is all in one direction. The science inspires a lot of artists, but artists rarely, if ever, inspire science. Science fiction writers are the exception. The arts and humanities can have their own academy, but finances not from the scientific budget, but from the creative arts and heritage budget. And while I think that his point is probably slightly overstated compared to a lot of the other opposition that we heard on this bill, Mr. Chair, it does reflect the feeling quite strongly held that the Royal Society is in fact going backwards in terms of bringing the humanities into the Royal Society. Now I think that view is mistaken, and I think as the Royal Society was actually saying in its submission, is the right one. In fact, the humanities are an extraordinarily important part of policy dialogue and other dialogue, and it is, as I quoted before, bringing that in is enormously important. So just to sort of wrap up on this particular point, Mr. Chair, and then I'll hand over to the Honourable Parakura Horomia, and I'll give him plenty of time to get to his feet. Thank you, Mr. Chair.